I walked that same mountain path twice, once in the dark going up, once coming back down when it was already over. I didn't know the first time that I'd remember every stone of it for the rest of my life. My name is Bardia. I was 20 years old. I was one of the king's 10,000, the Immortals, the Greeks called us later, though we never called ourselves that. And I'm going to tell you what it actually looked like, from our side of the spears. Not the version you've heard 100 times. The other one. I grew up in Persia, in the hill country, where the king's grandfather built his palace out of stone that took 10 years to carve. From the time I was 5, I trained. Bow first, then the horse. Then, when I turned 16, the spear and the wicker shield. Every boy in my village did the same. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was just what a Persian boy did. You learned to ride, you learned to shoot straight, and you learned to tell the truth. That's the whole of it, my father used to say. Ride, shoot, tell the truth. He'd fought under the old king, Darius, at a place called Marathon, on a beach in Greece. He came back. Most of his friends didn't. He never told me why we lost that day. I think he never really understood it himself. So when the call came, when the drums went through the province and the muster officer read out the king's order that every household must send a son for the invasion of Greece, I wasn't afraid. I was proud. My mother packed dried figs and bread into a leather bag and didn't say much of anything, just kept checking the straps on my gear like they might come loose from worrying too hard. My father wasn't proud. He just looked at me for a long time and said, "Watch the ground under your feet, not the man in front of you." I didn't understand that yet either. I would. We had a week before the muster officer marched us north to join the main column. I spent most of it with the other boys from my village who'd been called up, 6 of us out of maybe 40 households. We didn't talk about being afraid. We talked about the king, about Greece, about how the whole world was going to hear what we did there. That's what 20 years old sounds like, I think, in every country, in every century. Loud and sure of everything. You cannot imagine the size of that army unless you saw it. I still can't describe it right. We marched for months, and every day we picked up more men, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, men from Bactria with curved bows, men from India with clothes made of cotton nobody in Persia had ever touched. 50 nations, someone told me. 50 different tongues around the campfires at night, and none of us understanding more than a handful of words from the other. When we reached the strait they call the Hellespont, the engineers had built 2 bridges out of boats lashed together, hundreds of them, so the whole army could cross without getting its feet wet. There was a story going around camp, I don't know if it's true, I only know men repeated it like it was, that the first set of bridges had been wrecked by a storm before we even got there, and the king had been so angry he ordered the water itself whipped, 300 lashes, and had chains thrown into the strait as punishment. Whether that really happened, or whether it just grew in the telling, the way stories do around a campfire, I couldn't say. But it tells you something about how we all felt marching in that army. Like we were following a man who thought even the sea owed him obedience. I stood on that bridge and looked down at the water and thought, no king before ours ever did a thing like this. I believed, standing there, that nothing could stop us. Nothing built by men. That's the feeling I want you to hold on to, because it's going to matter later. We didn't march into Greece thinking we might lose. We marched in thinking the whole thing was already decided. So, tell me in the comments, if you were in my sandals watching that bridge, watching an army that size stretch further than your eyes could follow, would you have believed it too? Would you have felt invincible? We came down through Thrace, through Macedonia, and the local kings just opened their gates for us. Nobody fought. Why would they? And then, in the middle of summer, word came back down the column. The Greeks had finally stopped running. They'd picked a spot to make a stand, a narrow gap between a cliff and the sea, a place with a strange name, Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. I saw it for the first time from a rise in the road, and honestly at first I laughed. That was it? That was where they thought they could stop the King of Kings? A gap so narrow that maybe 10 men could stand shoulder to shoulder across it. A crumbling old wall at one end that the Greeks were rebuilding with loose stone. Behind them, a cliff going straight up. In front of them, the sea, close enough that you could hear it. Our scouts said there were a few thousand of them. A few thousand, against an army that outnumbered them many times over. I remember one of the older men in my unit, a man named Vahyas-Datta, who'd fought in Egypt, spitting on the ground and saying, "They'll run the moment they see the first wave." I believed him. Everybody believed him. We made camp. The king sent a rider to tell the Greeks that if they laid down their weapons, they could go home. The rider came back with an answer I didn't understand until later. Something short, something almost rude from the Spartan king. We waited 4 days for the rest of the fleet and army to catch up. 4 days, camped in front of a wall held by men we outnumbered, maybe 100 to 1. 4 days is a long time to sit and stare at an enemy who refuses to run. On the 5th day, the king sent in the Medes first, not us. The Immortals waited in the rear, in reserve. The king's personal guard, too valuable to waste on the opening blow. So I watched the first assault from a hillside, the way you'd watch weather roll in. The Medes went into that gap in waves, and the gap simply ate them. That's the only way I can describe it. The Greeks stood in a wall of shields and long spears, and our men had shorter spears, wicker shields that couldn't stop a Greek point, and nowhere to spread out because the pass was too narrow. Man after man went down in the front rank, and the ones behind climbed over the bodies to take their place, and the Greeks just kept killing. Part of the problem, I understood later, wasn't just the ground. It was how we fought compared to how they fought. Most of our infantry carried wicker shields, good against arrows, useless against a Greek spear thrust at close range. Our spears were shorter, built more for throwing and for open field fighting, where numbers and mobility mattered. None of that mattered here. There was no open field. There was a gap 10 men wide, and in that gap, the longer weapon and the heavier shield won every single time, no matter how many men we threw behind it. By afternoon, the Medes pulled back. The king, I heard later, actually stood up from his throne 3 times watching it in disbelief. 3 times. He sent in more troops after that, some of his best, men who'd fought at Marathon and never lost. Same result. The gap didn't care who you sent into it. That night, in our camp, nobody laughed about "they'll run" anymore. If you were commanding that army, with 100 men for every one of theirs, and still losing every wave, what would you have done differently? Because the king's answer to that question is coming up next. And it's the reason you're watching this video. I didn't sleep much. None of us did. Word moved through camp fast that the Spartans, the ones in front, were rotating their best fighters to the very front rank of that wall, taking turns so the tired ones could rest while fresh men held the line. That's discipline you don't expect from 4,000 men holding a beach. We expected panic. We got a machine. Someone in my unit, a boy barely older than me named Frada, asked our officer if the Immortals would be sent in next. The officer just said, "When the king decides we're worth spending." That was the first time I understood we weren't invincible either. We were valuable, which meant, until that moment, we'd been kept safe. Which meant somebody, somewhere, had decided the cost of that gap was finally worth paying with us. The camp behind the lines was its own kind of grim by then. Physicians moving between rows of wounded men, most of them beyond helping. The smell you'd expect. Men writing what messages they could for someone to carry home, in case. Frada gave me a small bronze token that night, something his mother had given him before he left Persia, and asked me to send it back to her if things went badly for him. I told him not to talk like that. He just shrugged and said his father had told him the same thing mine told me. Watch your footing. And that he figured it meant the same thing for both of us. I didn't sleep that night either. The order came at dawn, on the second day of real fighting. 10,000 of us, moving down toward that narrow strip of ground between the cliff and the sea. I remember my hands were steady. I remember being surprised that they were steady. We went in formation, tight, disciplined, the way we'd trained since we were boys. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought this would be different. We were the king's own. We didn't break. Then we hit the wall of spears, and I understood what the Medes had been trying to tell us all day without words. The Greek spears were simply longer than ours. In that gap, with no room to go around, that difference was the only thing that mattered. The man in front of me went down before he even reached striking distance, a spear point through the throat, and he just folded, and I had to step over him. And the man behind stepped over me if I'd gone down the same way. We pushed. We tried to use our numbers to force them back by sheer weight, shoving from behind, but the ground was slick with blood, and the dead were piling up under our own feet. And every time we got close enough to fight properly, another wave of that Greek wall was already there, fresh, rotated, rested. Our commander that day was Hydarnes, one of the king's most trusted generals, leading the 10,000 himself. He kept sending in fresh companies to relieve the ones getting cut down at the front, the same way the Greeks were rotating their own men. Except every time our fresh company reached the front, it just met the same wall, the same long spears, the same result. Twice I thought we'd finally broken through, when the line in front of us seemed to waver for a moment. Both times it closed back up before we could push into the gap. Frada died, maybe 10 feet from me. I didn't see it happen. I only saw him afterward, on the ground. And by then we'd already been pushed back twice. We call ourselves Immortal, because when a man of the 10,000 falls, another man is standing ready behind him, and the number never drops below 10,000. I always thought that name meant something about us as fighters. That day I learned it just meant the king never runs out of names to replace us with. We pulled back at dusk. We had not moved that Greek line one single step in 2 full days with everything the king had sent. I lay awake that night thinking about my father, about watch the ground under your feet, not the man in front of you. And for the first time I understood. He wasn't talking about footing on a battlefield. He was talking about how easily a man forgets that the ground can open up under an army that thinks it cannot lose. On the third morning, everything changed, and it had nothing to do with fighting. A local man was brought into the king's tent, a Greek, from somewhere nearby, one of the hill villages. I never learned exactly why he did what he did. Some said money. Some said an old grudge against the men holding the pass. I still don't fully know, and I won't pretend I do. What I know is that within an hour, my company was told to gather rations, leave our heavy gear, and prepare to march at night. There was a path, a goat track, really, cutting up through the mountains behind the Greek position, coming out somewhere above and behind that wall they'd been dying to defend for 3 days. The local man knew every turn of it. Before I tell you what that path led to, would you have taken it? Knowing it meant climbing a mountain in the dark, on a stranger's word, to come out behind an enemy that had already beaten every straight fight you'd thrown at them? Let me know down below, because that's exactly the choice 10,000 of us made that night. We left after dark, under Hydarnes again, the same general who'd led us into the pass that afternoon, quiet as we could manage in armor. The path was worse than anyone had described. Loose stone, oak scrub tearing at your legs, a drop on one side you couldn't see the bottom of. We climbed most of the night in near silence. No torches, just starlight and the man ahead of you to follow. Twice, men slipped and went down hard on the rocks, and we had to leave them where they fell, because stopping the column on that path wasn't something anyone was willing to risk. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Even the sound of our own breathing, after a while, started to feel too loud. I kept thinking about the Greek wall in the pass below, the one we couldn't break in 2 days of open fighting, and how strange it was that the answer to it wasn't a better spear or a bigger wave of men. The answer was simply walking around it in the dark, using ground nobody had bothered to guard properly. Near dawn, at the top, we came on a group of Greeks, not Spartans, a different contingent, men from a place called Phocis, guarding the very path we were using. They heard us coming through the brush and scrambled to arm themselves, more startled than ready. There was a short, ugly fight in the gray half-light, arrows first, then close, and they pulled back onto a hill above the path to make their stand there instead of blocking it. Hydarnes didn't stop to finish them. That was never the point. He pushed the column past them, down the far side of the mountain toward the rear of the pass, toward the Spartans from behind. I remember looking back once, at the Phocians standing on their hill, watching us go, and understanding that they knew exactly what we were marching toward, and there was nothing left they could do about it. By the time the sun was properly up, a runner had already gone ahead to warn the men in the pass. I heard, much later, what happened down there once the warning came. That the Greek commander, the Spartan king, called a council, and most of the allied troops from the other cities were sent away. Only a small group chose to stay and hold the position anyway, knowing exactly what was coming down that mountain behind them. Spartans, men from Thespia, a contingent from Thebes, though what happened to them afterward is still argued about, whether they stayed by choice or were kept there. I wasn't in that council tent, obviously. I only know what came after, because I was part of it. We came down onto the flat ground behind the pass in the late morning. From the front, the main army was already pushing in again, harder than the 2 days before, because now the Greeks knew there was no reason left to hold ground meant only to buy time. From behind, we closed the trap. I want to be honest about this part, because it's the part people usually skip. It wasn't a clean battle by then. It wasn't 2 lines meeting in open ground. It was a few hundred men surrounded on all sides by thousands, in a space too small for real formations to matter anymore. Spears broke. Men fought with swords, then with knives. Then, I was told, some with bare hands, once even their swords snapped. I didn't reach the center of it myself. The crush of our own men was too thick, everyone pushing forward to be the one who broke that legend. I saw it from maybe 30 feet back, through gaps in the press of bodies. I saw their king go down, a man they said had led from the very front for 3 straight days. And even after he fell, his own men fought over his body instead of running, dragging it back each time we nearly took it, until eventually we did. I've never seen anything like that before or since. Men who already knew they'd lost, still fighting over a corpse like the ground it lay on mattered more than their own lives. I didn't understand it then. Standing here now, I think I understand it a little better. What was left of them? A handful, maybe 40, maybe fewer. Pulled back onto a small rise of ground with the wall at their backs and just stopped retreating. There was nowhere left to retreat to. I watched that last stand from the crowd of our own soldiers, packed in so tight I could barely lift my arm to point. They didn't break. I need you to understand that, because it's the part that stayed with me longer than anything else from that day. Every spear was gone by then. Some fought with broken spear shafts. At the very end, when I could finally see the center of it, men were fighting with their bare hands and teeth. And they still weren't running. We finished it with arrows, in the end, ordered to just fill the air with them until it was over, because getting close enough for a clean fight was costing too many of our own. I remember the order going down the line, and the strange sound of thousands of bowstrings all at once, and then almost nothing after. No more shouting from that little rise of ground. Just the sound of arrows landing on shields that had stopped being lifted to block them. I knocked an arrow myself. I don't know if it was mine that struck anyone specific. I've told myself that for years, that I don't know. And some days I believe it. When it was quiet, really quiet, for the first time in 3 days, nobody around me cheered. I remember that clearly. 10,000 of us had died over 3 days to take that gap in the mountains, and when we finally held it, the men standing around me looked less like conquerors and more like men who'd survived something they didn't want to describe to their families. The king came down to see the ground himself afterward. I watched from a distance as he stood over the body of their king and gave an order I still don't like remembering: to take the head and put it on a stake for every soldier marching past to see. Some say it was rage. Some say it was meant as a warning to the rest of Greece. I only know that even some of our own officers went quiet when the order was given. The same kind of quiet as after the fighting stopped. We buried our dead in mass graves and marched on within days, toward Athens, toward the rest of the war. Because for the king, this gap in the mountains was never the goal. It was one obstacle on the road to a much bigger prize. I heard much later that our navy lost badly at a place called Salamis not long after, and that eventually we had to go home without finishing what we'd started. I wasn't there for that part. I was already marching south with the rest of the army, still thinking about the sound the pass made when it finally went quiet. I still don't know what to call what happened at Thermopylae. We won the ground. Everyone who could tell you that knows we won the ground. But I've never once, in all the years since, heard a Persian veteran of that campaign brag about it the way my father used to talk about other battles. Nobody wanted to relive it. We just wanted it to be over. Frada's mother lives 2 houses from mine, back in Persia. I brought her that bronze token myself, the year after I came home. I didn't tell her about the arrows, or the sound the pass made at the end, or any of it really. I just told her he'd fought bravely, which was true, and that it had been quick, which I don't actually know. Some things you carry for other people, so they don't have to carry them at all. I think that's most of what this whole campaign was, if I'm honest. An entire empire's worth of men carrying things quietly, so the histories written afterward could say we won. That's the side of the hot gates you don't usually hear. The side of the men who were told they couldn't lose, and found out exactly what it costs to be wrong about that, over and over, for 3 days, before they finally weren't wrong anymore. If you want the other side of this same war, the one where the king loses, not wins, go watch the video on this channel about the Persian retreat at Salamis, or the one about Darius running from Gaugamela 150 years later. Same empire, very different endings. And if you're new here, this channel does exactly this. Real wars, told from the side you don't usually get to hear. Hit subscribe if that's your kind of thing. See you in the next one.